Pre-registered coordinates, 11 days of surveillance, one predictable mistake. This wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The Buk-M3 battery had been guarding the western approaches to occupied Tokmak for weeks. A medium-range surface-to-air missile system, one of Russia's most capable air defense platforms, able to engage targets at ranges exceeding 70 kilometers and altitudes up to 35 kilometers. Its radar could track dozens of aircraft simultaneously. Its 4 launchers, each carrying 4 ready missiles, gave the battery 16 shots before reloading. On paper, it was nearly untouchable. Nearly. Every piece of military equipment, no matter how sophisticated, has one vulnerability no engineer can design away: the crew operating it. Crews develop habits. Habits become patterns. Patterns become predictions. And predictions, in modern warfare, become targeting coordinates. This is the story of how a Ukrainian signals intelligence cell spent 11 days in the dirt, watching, waiting, mapping every movement of that battery, every emission, every displacement, waiting for the one moment when the system that was supposed to be invulnerable would expose itself. Then, in 72 seconds, ending it. I'm your host at UkraineRadar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're breaking down one of the most patient and precise air defense ambushes of the entire conflict. A story about how intelligence, discipline, and HIMARS precision combined to eliminate a threat that had been denying Ukrainian aircraft access to Russian rear areas for over a month. What happened near Tokmak wasn't just the destruction of a missile battery, it was the opening of a corridor. And what flew through that corridor afterward changed the tactical equation across an entire section of the front. Stay with us. The 72 seconds that end this story begin with 11 days that most documentaries would never have the patience to tell. And those 11 days are where the real story lives. To understand the target, you need to understand why the Russians put it there. Tokmak sits at the intersection of several critical Russian supply routes in occupied Zaporizhia Oblast. The town had been converted into a major logistics hub, a transshipment point for ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements feeding Russian positions along a significant stretch of the front line. Protecting Tokmak meant protecting the arteries that kept Russian forces supplied and mobile across this sector. The Buk-M3 battery deployed to cover the western approaches served a specific strategic function. Ukrainian F-16s, operating from airfields further west, had been probing Russian air defenses across this sector in the weeks before the operation we're examining. The flights were reconnaissance in character, testing radar coverage, cataloging emission signatures, mapping the gaps. The Russians knew this. They responded by deploying additional air defense assets to close those gaps. The Buk-M3 was their answer to the F-16 threat. The system represents a significant generational leap over its predecessors. Where the original Buk series dated to Soviet-era Doctrine, the Buk-M3 used modern phased array radar, digital fire control, and improved missiles capable of engaging targets across a much wider envelope. Each transporter erector launcher carried 4 9M 317M missiles. The command and engagement stations served as the battery's brain, fusing data from the acquisition radar and distributing engagement authority to the launchers. Russian doctrine called for frequent displacement. A battery that stays in one position too long becomes a target. Move regularly, maintain emissions control during transit, and radiate only when the tactical situation demands engagement. In theory, this kept the battery survivable even against an enemy with significant SIGINT capability. In practice, it created a pattern. Which weapon do you think proved most decisive in this operation? A. HIMARS precision strike. B. SIGINT collection. C. Drone reconnaissance? Drop your answer in the comments below. The Ukrainian Signals Intelligence Cell didn't know exactly what pattern the Buk-M3 crew would develop. They knew, from experience with dozens of similar operations, that a pattern would emerge. It always did. Humans are creatures of routine, especially under the grinding stress of sustained combat. The crew of this battery had been in the field for weeks before the Ukrainian observers even identified their presence. They were tired. They were cautious the way tired people are cautious, which is to say not cautious enough. The cell established its observation post 11 days before the strike. The exact location cannot be disclosed, but the tactical logic is straightforward. A position with line of sight to the likely displacement routes, far enough from the battery to avoid detection, close enough to collect meaningful visual and electronic signatures. The team included specialists in signals, intelligence collection, drone operation, and fire coordination. Their equipment included passive SIGINT receivers capable of logging radar emission characteristics and small reconnaissance drones for visual confirmation. The first 3 days produced nothing actionable. The battery displaced twice, each time following an unpredictable route, each time maintaining strict emissions control during movement. The crew was disciplined, professionally so. Then, on the 4th day, something changed. The battery's radar briefly activated during a displacement. Not a full engagement emission, not the high-power sweep of a system preparing to fire. A low-power check signal, the electronic equivalent of a crew verifying their equipment, was functioning correctly after a road march that vibrated every connection and joint in the vehicle. The emission lasted less than 8 seconds. The Ukrainian SIGINT receivers logged it at a specific frequency, a specific pulse repetition interval, a specific geographic location. One data point. Not enough. But the observers noted something else. The displacement had begun at approximately 2 a.m. local time, and it had ended at a position roughly 4 kilometers northeast of the previous location, in a tree line that offered good concealment from aerial observation. The crew had found a position they liked. They stayed there for 36 hours before displacing again. The second displacement happened at approximately 2 a.m. The third displacement happened at approximately 2 a.m. By the 6th day, the pattern was clear. The battery displaced in the early morning hours, before dawn, when Russian logistics traffic was lightest, and the chance of being caught in the open by Ukrainian air was lowest. The displacement route favored certain roads, certain tree lines, certain geographic features offering the most direct path between the battery's 2 preferred concealment positions. And during displacement, for a window of between 6 and 14 minutes, the crew sometimes activated the low-power check emission. Sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. The Ukrainian cell began building a predictive model. If the battery departed its southern position, it would almost certainly take the northern route. That route passed through a specific grid square that offered no concealment for approximately 90 seconds. A 90-second window of exposure. Stay with me, because what happens in the next segment destroys an entire battery and opens a corridor that F-16s would fly through within 72 hours of the strike. The fire coordination specialist in the cell had been maintaining a target folder since day 4. Every displacement logged, every emission captured, the 2 preferred positions plotted in detail, the transit route modeled. By day 8, the folder contained enough information to submit a strike request, but the cell leader held back. This was the first obstacle. The intelligence was good, but not conclusive. A strike on a suspected position against a target that had already displaced would waste HIMARS rockets and alert the battery crew that they'd been identified. If the Russians discovered they were being watched, they'd change their patterns entirely. The battery would go dark. The cell needed certainty. They needed to catch the battery in transit, at a known location, at a predictable time, not a suspected location, a confirmed one. The solution came from combining drone observation with signal analysis. A small, fixed-wing reconnaissance drone, operating at altitude well above visual detection range, was tasked to orbit the battery's northern position during the early morning displacement window. If the battery departed the southern position, the drone would have approximately 4 minutes to reposition and observe the transit route before the battery reached the exposed grid square. 4 minutes. The margin was thin. Day 9, the battery did not displace. The crew stayed in the northern position. The drone orbited uselessly and was recalled before dawn to avoid detection. Day 10, the battery displaced. The drone repositioned successfully. The transit route was confirmed visually. The exposed grid square was confirmed. The timing was logged. The emission occurred during transit. Duration, 11 seconds. The target folder was complete. How many launchers did the Buk-M3 battery field in its standard configuration? A-2 launchers, B-4 launchers, C-6 launchers? We'll give you the answer before the end of this video. The strike request went up the chain on day 10. The HIMARS battery that would execute the strike was located well outside Russian counter-battery radar range, a precaution that had become standard after Russian forces demonstrated the ability to track HIMARS launch signatures and respond with counter-battery fire within minutes. The M142 HIMARS launcher is a single truck-mounted system capable of firing GPS-guided rockets with a circular error probable of less than 5 meters at ranges exceeding 80 kilometers. Its M31 GMLRS rockets travel at high subsonic speed, reaching their targets in seconds rather than minutes. The strike was approved. Coordinates were loaded. But the execution window was narrow. The cell would need to confirm that the battery had departed its southern position, then signal the fire coordination network. The HIMARS battery would need to receive the execute order, drive to its firing position, and complete launch preparation, all before the Buk-M3 reached the exposed grid square. The timing analysis suggested approximately an 8-minute window from confirmed departure to transit exposure. 8 minutes from a standing start to have HIMARS rockets in the air. Subscribe to UkraineRadar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what comes next is the strike sequence that the Ukrainian General Staff would later describe as a textbook precision interdiction. The night of the planned intercept arrived cold and overcast. Ground fog had developed in the low areas between the battery's two preferred positions, reducing visibility at ground level to less than 200 meters. The Ukrainian cell had been in their observation post for 11 days. Their equipment was functioning. Their protocols were rehearsed to the point of automaticity. But the fog introduced a new variable. It might cause the battery crew to delay their displacement, choose a different route, or cancel the movement entirely. This was the second obstacle, and it nearly derailed everything. The cell leader made a command decision. They would commit to the strike window regardless of the fog. The reconnaissance drone would operate above the fog layer, using thermal imaging to track vehicle heat signatures. If the battery moved, they would see it. At 1:47 a.m., the thermal camera detected movement at the southern position, vehicles powering up. Engine heat signatures consistent with the battery's tracked vehicles and wheeled command post. The fire coordination chain activated. The signal went from the observation cell to the fire's coordination element, from there to the HIMARS battery. The HIMARS crew, on standby for 3 days, received the execute order at 1:51 a.m. The launcher was already pre-positioned. The crew had calculated their firing azimuth, elevation, and fuse settings the previous evening, updating for current atmospheric conditions before their shift began. At 1:54 a.m., the M142 HIMARS launcher elevated its pod. At 1:55 a.m., the first rocket left the rail. 6 M31 GMLRS rockets were fired in a ripple sequence over 14 seconds, each guided by GPS, each following a ballistic arc that would bring it down on the target coordinates with an expected accuracy of less than 5 meters. 6 rockets, 6 target points distributed across the exposed grid square and the most likely positions within it. Flight time to target, 72 seconds. If you believe that intelligence and patience are force multipliers that no weapon system can replace, type UkraineRadar in the comments. Because what you're about to hear is proof. At 1:56 a.m. and 44 seconds, the first M31 impacted the transit route in the exposed grid square. The Buk-M3 battery was precisely where the Ukrainian intelligence model predicted it would be. The reconstruction, drawn from satellite imagery analysis, combat drone footage, and intercepted communications reviewed by Ukrainian military analysts, describes what happened in the 60 seconds following first impact. The lead vehicle, the command and engagement station, took a near-direct hit from the first rocket. The warhead, a 90-kilogram unitary fragmentation device, detonated within 3 meters of the vehicle's hull. The blast and fragmentation pattern penetrated the lightly armored hull, destroying the electronic systems inside and killing or incapacitating the crew members present. The second and third rockets arrived within 4 seconds of each other, impacting the transit route approximately 30 meters behind the command vehicle. The battery's transporter erector launchers were moving in column formation, the standard procedure during night displacement. The second and third impacts caught the column in the most exposed section of the transit route, where the tree line on either side offered no shelter from blast or fragmentation. The fourth and fifth rockets targeted the positions where thermal analysis suggested the rear vehicles of the column were located. The sixth rocket was allocated to the radar vehicle, which the drone had tracked as the last vehicle in the column. Ukrainian sources confirmed the assessment. 4 of the battery's vehicles were destroyed outright. A fifth was heavily damaged and later confirmed destroyed when it failed to move under its own power. The radar vehicle, which had briefly separated from the column to negotiate a difficult section of road, sustained fragmentation damage but survived the immediate strike. 1 vehicle escaped. 5 were destroyed. What would NATO have done differently in this strike scenario? Could a different allocation of rockets have achieved complete destruction? Comment your tactical analysis below. The intercepted communications that followed the strike were described by Ukrainian intelligence personnel as characteristic of catastrophic unit loss. The initial reports reaching Russian rear area coordination centers were fragmented and contradictory. One transmission described the battery as under air attack. Another reported unknown weapons impact. A third received approximately 20 minutes after the strike, requested immediate medical evacuation, and listed 6 personnel as killed or critically wounded. Russian air defense coordination for the sector went dark for approximately 90 minutes following the strike. The Buk-M3 battery that had been providing medium-altitude coverage over the western approaches to Tokmak was gone. The gap in Russian air defense coverage was immediately apparent to both sides. Ukrainian General Staff reports from the period confirmed what the strike was designed to achieve. Within 48 hours of the battery's destruction, Ukrainian F-16s began operating in the airspace that had previously been denied. The sorties were not uncontested, as Russian forces had other air defense assets in the region, but the specific corridor the Buk-M3 had covered was now accessible. The follow-on effects cascaded. Aircraft operating through the newly opened corridor were able to engage targets in Russian rear areas that had been unreachable while the battery was active. Satellite imagery analysis confirmed strikes on logistics nodes, vehicle assembly areas, and command infrastructure that had previously been sheltered behind the Buk-M3's coverage envelope. The battery's destruction was, in military terminology, an enabler. It didn't win a battle by itself. It opened the conditions for battles to be won. This is the logic of modern integrated warfare that Russian planners consistently underestimated in this conflict. Every air defense battery is not just a weapon. It is a shield. Remove the shield, and everything behind it becomes vulnerable. The Ukrainians understood this better than their opponents did. They invested significant intelligence resources, 11 days of observation, sophisticated SIGINT collection, drone coordination, precisely because they understood that the battery's value as a target vastly exceeded its replacement cost. A Buk-M3 battery costs approximately $150 to $200 million to field in combat configuration. 6 HIMARS rockets, at approximately $160,000 each, cost under $1 million. The return on investment, measured in systems destroyed, was extraordinary. But the real return was measured in the airspace it unlocked and the targets that airspace subsequently made accessible. Here's the question at the center of this entire operation. Was the Russian crew responsible for their own destruction? Or did the system that was supposed to protect them fail? The displacement doctrine that Russian air defense units follow exists precisely to prevent the kind of targeted strike we've described. Move frequently. Maintain emissions control. Don't establish patterns. The doctrine is sound. Military analysts across NATO have acknowledged that mobile air defense is genuinely difficult to target, precisely because the target isn't where it was when the intelligence was collected. The Buk-M3 crew followed their doctrine. They displaced regularly. They maintained emissions discipline most of the time. They chose tactically sound concealment positions. But they displaced at the same time. They used the same routes. They favored the same positions. The doctrine said, be unpredictable. The crew heard, displace regularly. Those are not the same instruction. Predictable displacement is not survivable displacement. And in a conflict where the opposing intelligence apparatus has demonstrated consistent ability to identify, track, and target mobile systems, the margin for pattern development is effectively zero. Russian military culture, particularly in the mid-level technical units that operate systems like the Buk-M3, has historically struggled with the gap between doctrine as written and doctrine as practiced. The written doctrine correctly identifies the risks of predictability. The practiced doctrine, shaped by crew fatigue, terrain constraints, and the human need for routine under sustained stress, collapses back toward pattern. Ukrainian intelligence analysts understood this. They weren't waiting for the battery to make a mistake. They were waiting for the battery to be human. And humans, under sustained operational stress, with the same terrain and the same options and the same tired crew making the same decisions night after night, become predictable. 11 days of waiting is a long time. But it was less time than it would have taken to find another Buk-M3 battery to replace the one that the patients produced. There is a second lesson embedded in this operation that deserves examination: the role of the complete fires chain in enabling precise interdiction. The HIMARS system is rightly celebrated as a transformative capability. Its precision, range, and rapid employment have made it one of the most impactful Western contributions to Ukrainian combat power. But HIMARS is a trigger, not a solution. The round arrives precisely where it is aimed. The question is whether it is aimed correctly. In this operation, the targeting chain stretched from a small cell of observers in a concealed position, through a signals intelligence processing element, through a fires coordination node, to the launcher crew. Each link in that chain had to function correctly, communicate clearly, and execute without hesitation, all within an 8-minute window. That kind of integrated performance doesn't emerge spontaneously. It is trained, rehearsed, and refined through repeated operations. The Ukrainian military's ability to execute this kind of compressed fires coordination cycle has improved dramatically over the course of the conflict, through a combination of Western training support, battlefield adaptation, and the accumulation of operational experience. NATO doctrine for fires coordination describes a process called the sensor-to-shooter cycle, the time elapsed from target detection to weapon impact. In conventional Cold War-era doctrine, that cycle was measured in hours. In Ukrainian practice against time-sensitive mobile targets, it has been compressed to single-digit minutes. This compression is not just a technical achievement. It represents a fundamental shift in how fires are integrated with intelligence, and it is one of the more significant doctrinal developments to emerge from this conflict. The Russian military, which entered the conflict with significant technical advantages in artillery and air defense, has been slower to develop this kind of integrated precision fires capability. Their targeting processes, shaped by Soviet-era centralization and bureaucratic fire mission approval chains, operate on timelines that are often incompatible with striking mobile targets before they displace. By the time a Russian strike mission against a Ukrainian mobile target completes its approval cycle, the target has frequently moved. This asymmetry in fire's tempo has been a persistent Ukrainian advantage, enabling smaller forces to achieve effects against larger and better-equipped opponents by consistently hitting targets that the Russian fire system cannot engage at comparable speed. Has patience as a tactical virtue been sufficiently recognized in how we assess modern warfare? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Genuine question, and we read every one. The aftermath of the strike extended beyond the immediate tactical consequences. Russian air defense commanders in the sector, now aware that the Buk-M3 battery had been tracked and struck during what should have been a routine displacement, issued immediate guidance to remaining units. Displacement protocols were reviewed. Timing was randomized. Route selection criteria were updated. These adjustments degraded the overall effectiveness of Russian air defense in the sector. Units that increased their displacement frequency and randomized their timing spent more time in transit and less time in effective engagement positions. Units that changed their established routes sometimes chose positions that were tactically inferior, offering better electronic emission security at the cost of worse radar coverage geometry. The ripple effects of a single precise strike propagated through the entire Russian air defense network in the area, not because the remaining units were destroyed, but because the knowledge that one battery had been identified and struck made every other battery crew uncertain about their own security. That uncertainty changes behavior, and changed behavior has tactical consequences. Ukrainian air operations in the sector, which had been carefully constrained to avoid the engagement envelope of the now destroyed battery, gradually expanded as Ukrainian pilots and planners assessed the degraded air defense coverage. The corridor that opened with the HIMARS strike widened as Russian responses to the new tactical situation created additional gaps. This is the compounding logic of successful deep interdiction. One strike doesn't just destroy its direct target, it forces adaptation. Adaptation creates new vulnerabilities. New vulnerabilities enable additional strikes. The cycle, when initiated against the right target at the right moment, can cascade through an opponent's defensive system in ways that are disproportionate to the initial investment. The 11 days the Ukrainian cell spent observing the Buk-M3 battery were not just preparation for one strike. They were investment in understanding how that battery operated within its broader system. That understanding informed not just the strike that destroyed it, but the assessment of how its destruction would ripple through the network it had been part of. Real tactics. Real consequences. This is what UkraineRadar exists to explain. The human dimension of this operation deserves acknowledgement that tactical analysis alone cannot fully provide. The observation cell spent 11 days in a concealed position in occupied territory. The details of their specific conditions are not publicly available, but the general parameters of such operations are well documented. Small teams, 2 to 4 personnel in most configurations, operating from hide positions that must be maintained continuously and silently. Communication restricted to minimize electronic emissions. Supply support limited to what can be carried in or delivered covertly. The psychological weight of operating for 11 days in close proximity to an active Russian military system, knowing that discovery would be catastrophic, is not easily quantified. These are not special operations forces in the Hollywood sense. They are trained military professionals executing a specific and demanding function under conditions that test physical endurance and psychological resilience equally. The discipline required to wait 11 days, to not act on day 4 when the first emission was logged, to hold the operation until the data was conclusive enough to justify the strike, reflects a quality of professional restraint that is harder to develop than any technical skill. The HIMARS crew that executed the strike operated with less awareness of the full intelligence picture. They received coordinates, timing, and an execute order. They performed their function with precision. But the weight of the 11 days of observation that made those coordinates valid rests on the soldiers who waited in the dirt, logging data, managing their concealment, and maintaining the discipline not to act until the moment was right. This is the invisible half of precision warfare. The weapon gets the attention. The intelligence that makes the weapon effective is usually classified, usually anonymous, and usually only visible in retrospect when the strike it enabled can be properly assessed. Now we arrive at the final accounting. The Buk-M3 battery that guarded the western approaches to Tokmak was eliminated. 5 of its 6 primary vehicles were destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. The battery's crew sustained significant casualties. Ukrainian sources estimate 6 personnel killed and additional wounded, though Russian casualty figures from individual engagements in this conflict are rarely confirmed with precision. The system, which cost the Russian defense establishment the equivalent of $150 to $200 million to field and combat configuration, was destroyed by HIMARS rockets with a total expenditure value of under $1 million. The F-16 corridor that opened in the days following the strike enabled follow-on strikes against Russian logistics infrastructure that Ukrainian military sources assessed as significant. Satellite imagery confirmed destruction of vehicle assembly areas, fuel storage points, and at least one command infrastructure element that had been previously protected by the battery's coverage envelope. The intelligence methodology that produced the strike sustained SIGINT observation, pattern analysis, predictive modeling, compressed fires coordination, was validated as operationally effective against mobile air defense targets. That validation carries implications for how Ukrainian forces will continue to approach the problem of degrading Russian air defense coverage in other sectors. The answer to our earlier quiz: the Buk-M3 battery fields 4 transporter erector launchers in its standard configuration, each carrying 4 9M 317M missiles for a total ready load of 16 rounds before reloading. The battery that was struck near Tokmak was operating in standard configuration. All 4 launchers were accounted for in the battle damage assessment. Was the decision to wait 11 days, rather than acting on day 8 when the target folder was arguably sufficient, the right call? The additional 3 days of observation confirmed the transit timing with enough precision to compress the fire's coordination window to 8 minutes. Acting on day 8 might have required a wider window and more rockets to achieve comparable effects. The cell leader's judgment to wait appears validated by the outcome, but the cost of those 3 additional days, in terms of operational security risk, crew fatigue, and the possibility that the battery might discover the observation, was real. Could the Russian battery crew have prevented this? The doctrine they were following was correct. The application was imperfect in one critical respect: time consistency. Randomizing their displacement timing, even within a narrow window, would have significantly complicated the targeting solution. A battery that sometimes displaces at 1:30 a.m., sometimes at 2:45 a.m., sometimes skips a night entirely, presents a fundamentally different targeting problem than one that displaces within a 30-minute window of the same hour every night. The margin between survivable and vulnerable in modern precision warfare is sometimes that small. What would you have done differently? If you were the battery commander, knowing that your crew needed routine to function under sustained operational stress, but that routine is what kills you in a precision fires environment, how do you balance survivability against operational effectiveness? There is no easy answer. But the question itself reveals something important about the fundamental tension at the heart of mobile air defense doctrine. Will Russian air defense units adapt their displacement protocols sufficiently to deny Ukrainian SIGINT the observation windows that operations like this depend on? Comment why yes or no, because this question will define whether these tactics remain viable through the next phase of the conflict. Subscribe to UkraineRadar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The fields near Tokmak are quieter now than they were during those 11 days of observation. The tree line where the Buk-M3 battery made its last displacement is just a tree line again. But the wreckage of 5 combat vehicles remains somewhere in that transit corridor, a reminder that in modern warfare, patience is a weapon. Intelligence is a weapon. And the 72 seconds between launch and impact are only possible because of the 11 days that preceded them. Modern warfare punishes predictability without mercy. Stay vigilant.